This is direct looking back at 9/11 and going back and looking forward on the war on terror and the debacle, which is the Biden administration foreign policy. We're joined by two folks that were there on Capitol Hill on 9/11, Governor Bob Ehrlich and Governor George Allen. And our hosts tonight are Mark Unkefer and Jason Trott. Take it away, guys.
Well, thank you very much, Dwight. And as you mentioned, this is a somber anniversary that's coming up, 20 years, and it is sort of bookended by what's happened in Afghanistan. But let me start off with both of your recollections as to what things were like on that day, 9/11, where I think we all remember what we were doing almost on a beat-by-beat basis. Governor Allen?
Well, I just had gotten elected to the U.S. Senate and got sworn in January of 2001. I had a meeting, a breakfast meeting with Washington natural gas folks, and on the way driving to my office, I get a call that a plane flew into one of the towers up in New York City. Then I get into where I park in the Russell office building. There's a courtyard. And I see all these guys with guns up on the roofs and looking around, and all military type folks. I said, "Hey boys, what in the heck's going on here?" And they said what happened. And Laura Bush was there, the first lady, to testify on education in a nearby building. They had to get her out. Then the second plane hit, and you knew we were under attack. And then when the Pentagon got hit, everyone, they already had evacuated the Capitol. Then they get the heck out of here, and it was absolute mayhem. And I told our staff, let's reconvene at our home. We just had moved up to Northern Virginia around Mount Vernon that Friday before. And I said, it gave everyone the address. Let's get the whole staff down there. You couldn't drive over the 14th Street Bridge because that was closed because of the Pentagon being hit. See all that smoke billowing. You had to go out 295 and over the Woodrow Wilson Bridge forward, and then reconvened and so forth, and try to figure out what all is going on. I filled up with gasoline. We had just moved. Fortunately, guns and ammunition were not moved by the mover, so I knew where my guns and ammo were, which was something you didn't know what was going to happen next. And then we all came back into the Capitol, or not to the Capitol, but around there to get a briefing that night. And then afterwards, the leaders of the Speaker of the House and the Dennis Hastert, and then Tom Daschle, who was the majority leader at that moment in the Senate, gave speeches, and there was a good number there, and we spontaneously broke into "God Bless America," and that was the resolve, the unity that people, regardless of what party they're in, where they're from, everyone was unified to bring justice to these terrorists who attacked our country. And then you find out later that one of our neighbors was in the Flight 77, American Flight 77, that crashed into the Pentagon, and others who were working in the Pentagon. And there's just so many. I could go on for endless times, but it was a time of resolve, a time for unity. And there's a lot of memories I have of it. It seems like a long time ago. In other ways, it just seems like last week. And then what's happening, you said, in Afghanistan. I just want everyone to understand, if you served in Afghanistan, you are helping protect our country. The songs of those days that I remember that I think exemplified the way the American spirit was Alan Jackson's "Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning" on that fateful day. And the other was Toby Keith's "Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue." And one of the lines in that song was, "Well, put a boot in your ass. It's an American way." And we need to still have that attitude in dealing with terrorists.
Governor Ehrlich?
Well, my story is similar. Certainly want to associate myself with the remarks of Governor Allen. I was at the time a whip in the whip organization under Tom DeLay in the House. We that morning had our fall agenda meeting at the White House. So a bunch of us got in a car, went up to the White House, and we had, I believe it was an 8 o'clock meeting. We were sitting there majority whip team and the president's senior staff talking about a fall agenda, the president's fall agenda, if you will. And I recall that when the first plane hit, we were notified, but the meeting went on. It was thought of an accident at the time. The White House acted accordingly as far as we could see, and we continued with our meeting. Once the second plane hit, Secret Service busted in and said, members get back to the Hill. I remember the White House being chaotic at the time as we left. Chaotic ride up to Capitol Hill. Nobody knows what's going on. Getting back to our office, meeting with my chief of staff, trying to figure out what to do. I remember specifically as part of that discussion, wondering whether we should let our interns go. That's how that was how. Sometimes it's large ball, sometimes it's small ball. And then at some point, soon after I returned to my office in Cannon, the Capitol Police came by and said, out, all members out, go, leadership's out of here. Members outside of leadership are ordered to, as Governor Allen said, leave now. And so I took my scheduler and I took my car, and we faced a massive traffic jam trying to get out of going south, obviously, going north back to Timonium. But the highways were jammed. Everything was jammed. Everything was closed. Nobody knew what to do. We were listening to the radio. My car broke down on the way home, believe it or not. My chief of staff was able to get out and come rescue us. I remember very specifically getting back to my townhouse in Timonium, Maryland. Kendall, my wife, was out front on the steps crying, as were all our neighbors. And we just sat outside on our curb and talked. And as we all did, we all tried at once to come to grips with what had occurred, where we were, and most importantly, where we were going from that moment on.
I think we mentioned at the outset that it was a moment of great unity within the United States, where we kind of all came together. And in some ways, the loss, as you mentioned, Governor Allen, I think we've all known people who died, and somehow, as we learned who those were, it made it all that much more personal, because it was hard to grasp just the sheer size and scale of all of that, of people lost in New York and in Pennsylvania and also in Washington.
Yeah. By the way, the people who died in Pennsylvania, that plane, from all indications, was headed towards the U.S. Capitol.
Right.
And those heroes tuck it down in Western Pennsylvania. And otherwise, I have no doubt, if it wasn't the Capitol, I don't know. They say it might be the CIA, but I think they were going after the Capitol. That's the symbol of the people's house. That's the representatives of our government. And, I mentioned that we just moved in the Friday before, and there was a little kid named Nick. And he saw that we had young kids then, and they saw bicycles moving off the moving van, and he thought, great, there's some kids his age moving into the neighborhood and somebody for him to play with. Well, lo and behold, it was his father. His name's Jake Jacobs, who was in that American Airlines Flight 77. And the way we met all our neighbors was a few days later they had a candlelight vigil supporting that family, and everyone was there, and that's how we met him. And I remember my kids would play with little Nick, and they'd say, he's falls off his bike sometimes, and this, that, and the other. And I said, you got to understand, kids, this is what he's lost his father, and that's affecting him psychologically. And whenever I could, not that I had much time, Bob knows members of Congress don't have much time to ever be with your family, but I'd always try to do things with them, throwing sticks in the river or whatever. And interestingly, when President Bush said we're going to go after Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, it was a Saturday, it was a weekend, and so I'm on the phone dictating a statement of support with my staff, and the doorbell rings, and I go to the front door. Oh, I was the only one at home, and there's little Nick. at the front door. And he says, is Forrest home to play? And I said, no, all my kids are gone, Nick. Come back later. And I said, and I was ready to close the door and say, hey, Nick, we're getting after those people who took your father. And he looked down, kind of shuffled his feet. And he says, yeah, I know. I said, well, we're going to get him for your father. So that's the irony of certain things that happened that I'll forever remember that young boy and the loss of his father and how it affected him. And their family ended up moving back to Kentucky. But it's there's just a lot of those type of stories. That's just one that I was touched by.
I think that it's important to remember that at the time in the weeks following 9/11, the entrance of the United States into the conflict, the role of our special operators, special forces, the role of the Northern Alliance, we won that war quickly. We, along with the Northern Alliance, won that war. And given the events, we'll get into the events of recent times, I'm sure, in a minute or two. But I think it's important to remember that our special operators performed heroic deeds at the time. Very few boots on the ground at the time. And we declared victory. Now, there's going to be 1,000 books written concerning the last 19 and a half years after victory, what went wrong, what went right, what went wrong. But I do think it's important to remember that everyone was together. It was the quote-unquote good war as opposed to the quote-unquote bad war in Iraq. But everyone truly was together with respect to winning that conflict in the shortest term possible, and we did.
Hey, by the way, all these flags up here, that was in my office. These are all the countries that supported us in the war in Iraq. In the war in Afghanistan, not Iraq. There's a few off when we got to Iraq, but those, it was unity in our country. It was unity around the world. The only ones that not have been with us are the likes of Iran and that ilk. But everyone knew this had to get done, and that needs to be remembered. That Al Qaeda had there was a war going on against us. We didn't realize it until 9/11. And you don't just say withdraw and say it's over. It's the eternal vigilance needs to be there. And we've done a lot of things since then to make our country safer. And that's why we haven't been hit with such a terrorist attack in the subsequent 20 years.
Yeah, I think the point that Governor Allen just made is the focal point of not only the discussion here tonight, next few minutes, but also going forward. There's everyone again is going to the lessons of Vietnam, the lessons of Afghanistan, but everybody understands that when you conduct limited wars, you expect limited results. This was not World War II. It was not ever going to be a completely defeated army. It was not going to be done in Germany or in Italy. It was going to be done in a tribal country that, to the extent people thought we could westernize the country, bring democratic institutions into that culture, that was just silly to begin with. But on the other side, and this is going to be lost shortly, and it should not be lost. We conducted a limited war. We won. Then we conducted a limited war for the next 20 years. Americans were never defeated on the battlefield. We decided a few weeks ago to leave. Now, with respect to what Governor Allen said, we can't lose sight of it. We lost blood. We lost treasure. We lost dollars. We also gained a tie. The Taliban continued generally to control the countryside, and girls were educated in the cities. No American combat casualties were reported for the last year and a half because the Taliban knew if they got out of their zone that President Trump was the president, and they were scared of him. There were great achievements with regard to civil society moving forward, the role of the police, again, girls educated. So it wasn't as though things weren't going well, particularly in the cities. It was a tie because that was the goal, a tie. We all know if we wanted to truly use all the assets of the United States military and kill everybody, we could have done it. That's never been the goal. So again, we go back to Vietnam, we go back to Iraq, we go back to Afghanistan. When the U.S. enters limited wars and uses limited assets, we should expect limited victories, i.e. ties. Gov, I'd love to hear your views on that, but I think we're getting lost with neocons from the right, and we're getting lost with progressives who simply want to move on. I think we need to understand what went down, what successes occurred, what failures occurred, and why, and then we'll get to where we are, where we go forward from here.
I think you're right in so many ways, Governor Ehrlich. You got to set objectives. What's the goal? The goal was to put a boot, light up their night like the 4th of July and put a boot in your ass. It's the American way. I mean, that was the attitude. That's what we want to do, especially after Osama bin Laden was killed. At that point, you got the key perpetrator has been taken out, and the question then is, how do you leave a residual force or not? And it wasn't just the U.S. Obviously, U.S. is most important, but France, Germany, Britain, other countries were also a part of this NATO effort there. And you could debate that endlessly. And I don't think it's the same in Afghanistan as, say, South Korea or Germany. Those are stable countries. And troops in South Korea have stopped another war. That war actually has never been ended. That's legally still at war. There was a reason to be in Germany and Europe after World War II. Afghanistan is just not a unified country to begin with. A bunch of tribes, it's different languages, divided by a gigantic, very high mountain range. And it's really ungovernable in many respects in a centralized way. And obviously, China's going to go in there. They're going to exploit. They couldn't care less about human rights. But the question is you got to be careful about this mission creep. And that's what Governor Ehrlich was talking about, that beyond getting after the terrorists and making sure it's not a safe haven for terrorists, and in fact, Osama bin Laden wasn't even in Afghanistan. They took him out across the border in Pakistan. I think it's still going to be a worry. My worry is with the way that we've left. You could debate endlessly whether we should have left or not. I don't mind us leaving. It's the way we've left. The way we've left is such a backward way of doing it. Even if you're not in the military, you always know if there's people being evacuated, it's women and children first, not the military. You don't pull the military and our contractors out first, leaving the women and children, the State Department, and all those diplomatic folks and the non-governmental agencies, all these civilian folks, leaving them behind. And then you got to pull the military back in to be able to get the women and children, so to speak, out. And so it's just such poor decision making on how we left by having the military leave first. On top of it, leaving all the valuable military equipment, ammunition. Heck, if you can't get it out, all these airplanes, you're going to put a lot of stuff on those airplanes and taking it out. And whatever you can't take out, you blow up. So it doesn't go into the hands of your enemies or for China and Russia and Iran to be able to redesign these. I remember, Bob, when you were in Congress, I was in the Senate where a drone crashed in Iran. And everyone was worried, oh my goodness, they're going to be able to do this. And I was like, gosh, we ought to have some button we can push that blows it up so they can't figure out how our drones work. Here we've left billions of dollars of really good technology and equipment to our enemies. And so the message from this just awful gut-wrenchingly ignorant. In my view, is the only word you could say is just oblivious sort of evacuation. Is that number one, you can make the U.S. run, but more importantly is how can you have trust in people to help us in the future? That human intelligence is really important. You want to have indigenous folks or people on the ground supporting you, and when you abandon them, including obviously there's Americans still left behind, but also those who risk their lives to help out the United States, and they're left behind to be tortured, murdered, and all that by the Taliban. So I said such a terrible message that I fear, I hope I'm wrong. I really hope and pray I'm wrong, but I just think that the image of the United States as a reliable, trustworthy partner has been damaged. I'll say that it's certainly not been helped by the way that this evacuation has been handled.
Yeah, Gov Allen just talked about 4 or 5 of the worst repercussions here, the worst decisions that were made. We could go on literally for the next 2 hours exploring those decisions with regard to impact on the allies, optics for the world, assets left, the whole 9 yards. But to me, I think I'm sure to you, Gov, and to all of us, the worst single decision was leaving Americans behind. When did American policy change? It's never been leave Americans behind. And in this case, our moral obligation extended beyond Americans, extended to those Afghans who helped us, who literally not only supported us, saved American lives. You talk to the military guys, those Afghans put themselves in harm's way for 2 decades and saved American lives. Now, they were saving their own country too, but they were saving our guys as well.
It's interesting. You make an excellent. That's been a challenge. My son, who served 2 tours as a Marine in Afghanistan, talks about both how his interpreter. He was in an area that's actually been back under Taliban control for about 5 years now, 6 years now, but getting that interpreter out was tough. And I know how strongly our servicemen felt about trying to get those people out. It must be extremely painful for them. I mean, for them specific, where there's a personal relationship, but they also know about so many other people who are in that position as well.
So this time last week, we all thought it doesn't get worse than this. It can't. We left Americans behind. We knowingly left Americans behind. We announced leaving Americans behind. We gave names to the Taliban. I mean, it doesn't get worse than that. And then it did. Because now it appears from more recent reports, last few days, that, and the State Department's objecting to these reports, but the people involved say not so fast, State Department. We now have, and it started last week. It started more than 7 days ago. We have civilian Americans putting themselves in harm's way, financing out of their own pockets these rescue missions. And so we are, which is awe-inspiring. It's unbelievable. It's patriotic. It's gutsy. It doesn't get better than that. But at the same time, we have the world's most expensive, best trained special forces on the sidelines. And now reports literally today that the State Department is not being so cooperative with regard to these civilian efforts. I mean, can it get worse than that? We leave them behind, and then the State Department doesn't help with regard to getting securing these folks with regard to these civilian efforts. I mean, the civilian efforts alone is crazy. That the thought that we have to go that route, that we can't use our military, the people, the best in the world, who want to do the job. Right. Who want to do the job. And I'll tell you, Gov Allen, if I was still in the House, I'd be asking the Pentagon, how much did we spend on you last year?
Yeah. What? I'd be upset. I'd bring in Mark. So I'm glad our Mark here, shared his views from his son who served. And I think of the people whose sons did not come back, or daughters who did not, and to watch this debacle. And to have these former special ops folks, this Pineapple Express and Operation Rescue or Recovery, they remind me of the Flying Tigers who were old aviators before we got into before Pearl Harbor, and they were flying in China against Imperial Japan, and these are America's best. But gosh, if they're going to be doing it, and if the State Department and our military is going to come up with excuses and act so detached, at least be of help to them, as opposed to a hindrance. What I hear and is similar to what you're hearing, Governor Ehrlich, and that is it's that they actually are so bureaucratic that they're actually harmful, and maybe they're resentful that these folks, these veterans who are civilians now, are embarrassing them by having to rescue people and get them across borders because they can't get in the airport. So now they're going to have to go. They're going across treacherous land to get to some border of another country, and it's not easy work. And they have no air cover. There's no assistance, and then they got to kind of encrypt whatever messages they might be giving because they don't want somebody to identify where they are because the Taliban or Al Qaeda or ISIS or whomever could take them out by knowing where they are and who they are.
And just think about for a moment how this aspect of the story is being interpreted in friendly countries and in unfriendly countries. We've seen how the Brits, the Germans, and the French have reacted. I mean, the Brits particularly have condemned the administration for its actions. Our NATO allies are angry, upset, embarrassed. And then on the flip side, how are the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the miscreants of the world looking at this particular aspect of, well, the American military is not being allowed to operate to literally do its job. So you have American civilians going out there doing this stuff. I mean, think how that, as bad as it is as a matter of substance, think how it looks to the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's a big worry. And you're talking about where do we go from here? And you get Iran, who's the largest state sponsor of terror. This is, of course, encouraging to them. And then China, who I look at as the greatest threat to our country, external threat to our country, where here they are, another year banning any celebrations in Hong Kong, or commemorations, I should say, of Tiananmen Square, and they're snuffing out freedom in Hong Kong, and they're thinking they play the long game. It's not as if they're going to attack some country next week or next year, but they have their eyes on Taiwan. They're putting naval bases and taking over all these areas in the ocean, South China Sea, and so forth. And I think they look at this and say, all right, yeah, they have that obligation with Taiwan, the Republic of China, of Taiwan. And do you really think the United States is going to come to their aid? Now, obviously, we're selling arms, and we need to back the freedom-loving people of Taiwan. But I think this puts them in a very precarious position with the expansionist ways of China.
I think that's an excellent point. We think of the Australians we're looking to be part of that coalition in Asia, that were in Afghanistan as well, not part of NATO, but certainly allies of us in every conflict we've had in the past. If you take a look at the Australian press in particular, they've been brutal, and they're just expressing how upset they are about all of this.
I also reject this use of the false dichotomy, which we saw so much during the Obama era. President Obama was a master at political rhetoric, and he used false dichotomies typically when a tough decision had to be made. And we saw it tried out by the White House just last week. The false dichotomy being, in this case, it was either this, what we did, or total war, or tens of thousands, literally it was tens of thousands of troops, as though there was not any options in between, as though what the President Trump negotiated was not available to this administration as well. I think the American public is not going to be fooled by this false dichotomy with respect to this engagement, Gov. Clearly, there's a lot of room between what we did, this failed policy, as we've described it this evening, as the American public, Republicans and Democrats are describing it, and war, boots on the ground war. That's not what President Trump negotiated. It's not been the case for the last decade and a half or more there. It's just not true. But they tried it out, and I don't think it's going to work.
Governor Allen, one of the fallouts from all of this has been a fairly intense criticism of the senior brass of the military. Now, Virginia is Maryland is too, but Virginia is also a big military state. Any thoughts about that criticism that's being headed towards? Again, it's not the soldiers, the Marine, the people on the ground, but the senior planners and the senior officers who are part of all of this.
Well, yes, the leadership, and it's not the troops, the people following orders, the people risking their lives. It's the leadership and the decisions of the leadership. And I know people say, oh, gosh, the Secretary of State ought to resign, the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this, that, and the other. That is, to be honest with you, Mark, so typical of Washington, personalizing it, trying to find some scapegoat. The decision that was made, and I just cannot imagine that some of the scenarios that were presented to President Biden had all sorts of scenario, the worst case, best case, and every case in between scenario. I cannot imagine that anybody, and this is we ought to know is, all right, what options were presented to the president? What were the scenarios? And so then you then plan according to the scenarios, and then you have backups, and you're constantly adapting to what the situation is. I cannot imagine that anybody who's been trained in military tactics, military strategy, would have a general saying, we're going to get our troops out of there first. We're going to evacuate. Let's get our men and women of our armed forces out there first. Let's leave all that armaments and those equipment behind. And then, of course, all these civilians will be able to get themselves out of there. The only people who are keeping stability in that country were 2,500. It was only 25 in the scheme of things, only 2,500, plus obviously the NATO forces. But still, it was a small footprint with great capabilities and especially air power and air cover. And and also our contractors were very much a part of all of that. And you take them out, then you're leaving all these civilians on their own. So I can understand the criticism because they follow orders. They don't want to criticize the president. The buck stops with the president. And I have to believe that he was given a lot of options, a lot of counsel, and I cannot imagine that any general said, get our troops out of harm's way first before all of the civilians.
I agree with Gov. Allen. I've been very light in my criticism with regard to our military because the reports in the media, not just the right-wing media, but the mainstream media, the legacy media, have been along the lines of what Gov was referring to. Military, they're not miracle workers. If you give them sort of limited options, if the predicate is we're getting out now give me my options. Well, that's not the military's fault. That's a political decision, right, Gov? The predicate was a political decision. We're getting out now, so you give me the options of whether we close the embassy, keep the embassy open, we support Bagram Air Force Base or not, or which airport. So it wasn't as though if it was just a clean playing field here, and it was what are my best options given what we're doing. Okay, that's one thing. But as Gov said, it's hard to believe anybody would have given that advice, what we actually did, if they weren't limited in their autonomy from the jump. It appears that from the press that the military was told, look, we're going, here's the deal, here's the schedule, it's August 31st, and here are your options now. So tell us what to do.
Yeah, and I think, and Governor Ehrlich, just even setting a date of August 31st, why would you ever let your enemy know when you're going? You would want to be doing it in a slow way. It's like you keep the campfires burning so the opposition thinks you're still there as you move the troops somewhere else. So the whole thing has just been so ineptly handled. And then again, as Governor Ehrlich said, it was a political decision compounded by a lot of mistakes. And I think just even giving a date when we're leaving gives your opposition an idea, all right, they got to be gone by then. And that artificial date, notwithstanding so many falsehoods that were told by this president, we're not going to leave any Americans behind. Well, they have left American citizens behind. There's no question.
Yeah, there's another aspect to this that I don't think it's been successful. I'd like to get everyone's views on this, but early on, week 10 days ago, the administration tried out, well, this is the Trump plan. And it just didn't stick because it wasn't true. And I think Republicans and some Democrats, in fact, have been pretty clear with regard this was in no way the Trump plan. Clearly, President Trump campaigned on ending endless wars. As Gov said, the American public, 85% with it, enough. But you do it the right way, and you do it in a way that guarantees you protect the success you've had. Going back to my earlier point about we had a tie. Upon leaving, we should have kept that tie, right? You limited war, limited means, limited achievements, but achievements nevertheless.
Governor,
So
I wanted to jump in. Sorry, Mark. Governor,
No,
I
go
wanted
ahead.
to jump in and ask a question. So I think it was today the Taliban released a list of names of their new leaders in their government they're establishing. And several of those leaders were let go in the prisoner swap headed up by President Obama for Bo Bergdahl. I wanted to see maybe Governor Allen to get your reaction on that first and about former Gitmo prisoners leading the Taliban government.
Yeah, that's
Kind of
just,
your reaction.
I mean, that's just adding insult to injury. Obviously, a ridiculous trade to have made. The trade was made, and it's just a reminder of that very poor judgment when that trade was made. This is what happens when you negotiate with terrorists.
A lot of people at the time criticized the decision, including someone on the left. As Gov said, is anybody surprised? Is anybody surprised by that bit of news today?
I don't think so. I don't think.
So I guess as we come to the end of our session here in a few minutes,
Sure.
the issue needs to be, where do we go from here? And not knowing exactly where here is makes that even more difficult issue to discuss, because as every day unfolds, today, for example, that's tidbit we just discussed. Gitmo graduates, if you will, now appearing in the quote unquote civilian government. So many questions to answer. Are we going to recognize this government? Are we going to send U.S. taxpayer dollars to this government? Are we going to ensure finally at some point Americans are protected here and gotten out of that country, in addition to our allies? How many allies that we told we would help have now been killed or captured by the Taliban? How are we going to rectify? How are we going to make up? How are we going to placate our European allies, our NATO allies, with respect to what we pulled here? And they're clearly on the record as no longer trusting the United States government. There are so many issues that will play out, I suspect, in midterm elections and in 2024. But again, where we go from here has to be, and I'll just close with this. I just mentioned 4 or 5 different issues. The one thing we can't afford to do is move on. You heard the speaker today. You've heard the administration. Afghanistan will take care of itself. We'll get them out, blah, blah, blah. Let's move on to phony infrastructure for $3.5 trillion. No, we don't move on. We don't move on clearly with respect to Americans left behind, but we don't move on to a host of these issues that impact our present, our future, as the greatest force for good in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And they want to switch to, and when you hear military folks previously answer questions about the greatest threat to the United States being climate change, it is very worrisome about where the priorities are. Of course, the Biden administration wants to change the subject from Afghanistan. He understands that this has been an embarrassment, that it's been a failure, and it's been harmful. But we cannot think that by us leaving Afghanistan or anywhere else that that we can let our guard down. We need to remain vigilant. I guarantee you that Al Qaeda, ISIS, a variety of terrorist organizations are only emboldened. They're only encouraged by what has happened. And in fact, if you have an enemy that you feel is weak, you're more likely to take them on. Ronald Reagan talked about peace through strength. You don't attack people that you're fearful of. And Governor Ehrlich mentioned President Trump, and they're fearful of it. If there's something that happens, we have the supposedly over the horizon ability to do something, to retaliate there. Use that over the horizon. Let's see it work and see if there's something that can be done whenever there's something that goes wrong or is a threat to us or the people we care about. And just holding back and thinking that everything's fine now and that it's been 20 years, that's been long enough, our attention is somewhere else, is the only way that letting our guard down is the only way that we can end up with another such a 9/11. One of the good things that I see that's going on, and we had the Young Americans Foundation on a few months ago, is they're doing this Never Forget project. They've been doing it with 2,977 flags planted on schools and college campuses. And it's been very, very successful. And it's something that we want to make sure that schools and students, some of which weren't even alive, or maybe they were real little kids then, let's remember the 2,977 American citizens who died on 9/11. And let's not, the 20th anniversary is not the last time we're going to remember 9/11. We need to keep remembering and learn the lessons therefrom.
In that respect, Gov and I are both football guys, and I believe it was Auburn University. We're very critical these days of woke on campus and all the craziness occurring in our colleges and universities. But I believe it was Auburn that kept those 13 seats empty to respect those American soldiers killed a week before last. That's the kind of stuff that has to happen. Never forget. And again, good for Auburn.
War Eagle.
Right. But we can't never afford to forget, because I read something today along the lines of American General was talking about what the Taliban were saying in that godforsaken country, which along the lines of, you Americans, you have really fancy watches, but we have time on our side. And the bad guys always say, China today, China, we have time on our side. The Americans are too lazy, too rich, too wealthy, to understand there's a real price to be paid for freedom. That's their premise. And there's nothing that's occurred in the last week or two to disabuse them of that premise.
That is certainly a sobering challenge, a sobering thought, but it's certainly a rather realistic one. I think that's the final note, unless you've got something to add, Governor Allen.
Only I want to thank you, Mark, and your son, and all the men and women who are serving in our armed forces, and also our law enforcement, first responders. Let's remember how they reacted on 9/11, going into burning buildings, trying to rescue people. There's still a lot of good people in the United States of America who are firefighters, police officers, and those in the armed forces. They deserve better leadership than what they're getting today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, next time you see somebody in a uniform, just buy them a cup of coffee. Just thank them. Thank them. Any uniform.
Thank you.
Thank all of y'all.
Thank you all.